Val Sorath had absorbed 11 civilizations. He knew what first contact looked like. He knew what it felt like. He knew the shape of it. That particular mix of fear and wonder that rose off young species the way heat rises off hot stone. The wide eyes, the trembling voices coming over the communication channels. The weapons pointed at ships that could have swallowed their entire fleet without noticing. It always went the same way. The Conclave Fleet arrived. The young species panicked. They scrambled whatever passed for a military. They pointed guns at things that guns could not touch. They broadcast confused signals on 17 different frequencies, half of them begging, half of them threatening, all of them saying the same thing underneath the words. "We don't know what you are. Please don't destroy us." Then the diplomats went in. The terms were explained. Conclave membership was offered. The species understood, at last, the size of the gulf between what they were and what the conclave was. And they accepted. 9 days on average. Sometimes 8. Once, famously 4. Never more than 14. Vel Sorath had done it 11 times. He expected to do it a 12th. He stood at the observation window of the sovereign patience and watched Earth turn in the darkness below, and he felt, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had been right about everything for 4 centuries, that this would be no different. The planet was blue and white and brown, small, unremarkable, just another wet rock circling just another ordinary star at the quiet, unfashionable edge of a spiral arm the conclave had largely ignored for 300 years. Yet he had read the file on this species twice. It was, in his professional opinion, a kind of miracle. Not the good kind, but the strange kind. The kind you look at and can't quite explain. The species called themselves humans. They had been fighting each other for most of their recorded history. Not the clean, organized wars that civilizations sometimes needed. Border disputes, resource conflicts, the occasional political collapse, but deep, grinding, total wars. Wars that swallowed cities whole. Wars that burned the land so thoroughly that nothing grew back for years. They had split their own atoms to make weapons before they could reliably feed their own children. They had filled their atmosphere with poison in exchange for cheap energy, and then spent a century arguing about whether they had actually done it. By any reasonable measurement, they should have been gone by now. And yet, they were still there. 7 billion of them, down on that blue rock, doing whatever they did on a Tuesday morning while 43 conclave ships held position above their heads. That was the part that sat wrong with Val Sorath. Not the wars, every young civilization had wars. Not the self-destruction. That was almost standard. What bothered him was the persistence. The way humanity kept surviving its own worst moments, the way a drunk man survives a fall down a flight of stairs. Not with skill, not with grace, just with the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to stop. He turned from the window. His aide, Liz, stood at the briefing table with her hands folded and her expression perfectly neutral. She was very good at that. She had been his aide for 60 years, and in that time she had mastered the art of the face that said nothing. "The human delegation has confirmed departure," she said. "They'll dock in approximately 3 hours. How many in the party?" 7. Vel Sorath looked at her. The conclave delegation numbered 43. They had brought 43 ships, a fleet that stretched across Earth's night sky like a second set of stars. The receiving bay of the Sovereign Patience alone could have housed a small city. The scale of it was deliberate. The scale of it was always deliberate. 7 humans in 1 shuttle. Military escort? None visible. Liz paused in the way she paused when data refused to fit into any category she had. They are also broadcasting music on the approach frequency. Val Sorath waited. "Something called jazz," she said. He looked back at the window. At the planet turning below, at the ordinary blue and brown and white of it. "Of course they are," he said. The shuttle docked at 0900 ship time. Val Sorath stood at the head of his delegation in the receiving bay. 43 of the conclave's finest diplomats, scientists, and legal scholars, arranged in precise formal order behind him. A wall of rank and species and 400 years of collected authority. The bay was designed for moments like this. The ceiling soared 30 meters above the floor, which was polished so perfectly that it reflected everything back doubled. The lighting was positioned to illuminate the conclave side and leave the docking port in relative shadow, so that whatever came through it stepped immediately into the presence of something enormous and certain. It worked. It had always worked. Well, species emerged from that shadow and looked up at the ceiling and understood, in the way that bodies understand things before minds do, exactly how large the universe had suddenly become. The docking port opened. 7 humans walked out. The first thing Soarath noticed was the pace of them. They walked slowly, not the stiff, careful walk of a creature trying not to show its fear. He knew that walk. He had seen it 11 times. But something else, something that did not have a good name. The walk of people who had nowhere urgent to be and were in no hurry to get there. The second thing he noticed was the man at the front. The file had said, Secretary General Idris Okafor, lead human negotiator, 63 years old, former military trauma surgeon. The file had included a photograph. The photograph had not conveyed the stillness of him. He was tall, dark-skinned. He had a face that had clearly been through a great many things. Not the soft face of a man who had been protected from the world, but the settled face of a man who had met the world directly and kept going anyway. He looked like bedrock. He looked like a man who had already thought through every possible outcome of this meeting, had made his peace with all of them, and was here now as a formality. He looked around the receiving bay. He took in the ceiling, the polished floor, the 43 ranked figures arranged to suggest the weight of history pressing down on him. The lighting designed to make him feel small. His expression did not change. He looked, Soarath thought, like a surgeon who had walked into a hospital at 3 in the morning so many times that the size of the building had long since stopped meaning anything to him. Then Okafor looked across 30 meters of deliberate, carefully engineered intimidation and looked directly at Soarath. He smiled. Not the desperate smile of a frightened species trying to appear friendly. Not the strained professional smile of a diplomat performing warmth. A small smile, a real one. The kind that said, I see what you've built here. I understand what it's for. It's fine. He walked forward, extended his right hand. Soarath had studied the custom. Humans pressed their right hands together when greeting, a gesture that dated back to a time when showing an empty hand meant you carried no weapon. He took it. The grip was firm, brief, ordinary. Inquiry Ambassador Soarath. Okafor's voice was low and unhurried. It carried no performance in it. Thank you for the welcome. He looked around the bay once more. Then he said, any chance of a cup of tea? The first formal session began at noon. Soarath sat at the head of the long negotiating table and watched the humans arrange themselves with quiet efficiency. Okafor took the center seat. To his left, the woman in the dark uniform, Admiral Chen Feng, introduced as an observer in a tone that gave the word no particular weight, sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes moving steadily across the conclave delegation. Not with fear, not with aggression, with the focused, patient attention of someone doing inventory. Soarath noted her, filed her, kept watching. 2 legal delegates, 2 scientific advisors. Now one man whose role was never explained, who sat slightly back from the table, who said nothing, who watched the conclave side with calm and simple attention. Like a man at a window, watching weather. On Admiral Chen's wrist, a small screen pulsed occasionally with incoming data. She glanced at it periodically, not with urgency, not with alarm, the way you glance at a clock in a waiting room. Liz had produced the tea. Human tea, dried plant matter steeped in very hot water, a custom that Soarath found almost ceremonially simple. Okafor had received it with genuine gratitude. He poured it into a dented metal thermos he produced from somewhere inside his jacket. Set the thermos on the table beside the conclave's precision instruments and quantum-encoded data crystals. The thermos sat there for the rest of the afternoon. Soarath kept looking at it. He was not sure why. The formal presentation of conclave membership terms took 2 hours. Soarath had delivered it 11 times. He knew every section. He knew which parts landed hardest on young civilizations. The scope of the conclave's territorial reach, the resource-sharing agreements, the legal surrender of unilateral military action. He knew the faces that species made when the full size of what they were joining and what they were giving up to join it became real to them. The humans listened. That was all. They listened. Okafor took notes in a small paper notebook. Actual paper, actual ink pen, the ancient scratching technology, and occasionally the pen would stop and he would look at the presentation screen with an expression of mild, interested attention. Like a student who finds the lecture genuinely useful, but is not surprised by any of it. Once, during the section on territorial jurisdiction, a section designed specifically to convey the full reach of conclave authority across 47 star systems, Soarath saw Okafor draw something in the corner of his notebook. A bird, roughly sketched, wings out. When the presentation ended, Soarath waited. The silence stretched. On the conclave side, 43 diplomats maintained perfect stillness. On the human side, 7 people sat quietly in the way people sit when they are waiting for the right moment to begin, not in the way people sit when they are stunned. Okafor clicked his pen. "Thank you," he said. "That was thorough. We have some points to discuss." He opened his notebook to a page of dense, small, organized handwriting that had clearly been there before today. They began. By the end of the first day, Soarath had developed 2 feelings that sat uneasily beside each other. The first was professional respect. The humans were good negotiators, better than he had expected from the file. They gave ground on minor points without any argument, small protocol agreements, communication channel arrangements, things that cost them nothing, and they held firm on others with no drama at all. No raised voices, no appeals to emotion or history or fear. Just a calm, direct. That particular term doesn't work for us. Here is an alternative. And then they waited. Clean, efficient. The product of preparation, not panic. The second feeling was harder to name and sat lower. It had started with the thermos. It continued with Admiral Chen's wrist screen, which pulsed periodically with data she absorbed in one glance and did not share. It sat in the careful, watchful patience of the man whose role was never explained. It lived in the way Okafor had looked at the receiving bay, at all that engineered architectural certainty, and smiled like a man looking at something he had already seen 100 times in 100 different forms. After the session, Soarath walked back to his quarters alone. The corridors of the sovereign patience were long and wide and very quiet. He passed 3 junior conclave delegates who nodded at him with the respectful certainty of people who had no doubts about how this would end. He nodded back. In his quarters, he pulled up the deep scan data from their approach through the outer solar system. On standard survey protocol, resource mapping, navigation data, hazard identification, he found 7 anomalies in the outer system beyond the ice giants. The scan had flagged them with a size estimate and then immediately added a confidence rating of 4%, meaning the scanning system itself did not trust what it was seeing. The shape of the readings was wrong for interference artifacts, which were diffuse and spreading. These were dense, bounded. The scanner had attempted to measure them 3 times and returned 3 different answers, and then simply stopped and marked them as unresolved. Soarath stared at the data for a long time. He filed it under background anomalies, closed the screen, sat in the quiet of his quarters while the sovereign patience held its position above the turning planet. Outside the window, Earth was half in light and half in shadow. The line between the two was clean and sharp. The terminator, the edge, the line that moved slowly and inevitably across the surface, the way all edges moved. He went to bed. He lay there in the dark for a while before sleep came. He was thinking about the smile, the small, real one, the one that said, "I see what you've built here. It's fine." He had absorbed 11 civilizations. Not one of them had looked at the receiving bay and smiled like that. In the morning, Liz came to his door before breakfast with her hands folded and her expression doing the careful, neutral thing. "I reviewed the outer system scan data," she said. "So did I. The anomalies, interference artifacts," he said. Liz looked at him. He looked at Liz. In between them, the silence had the particular quality of 2 intelligent people deciding together, without speaking, to leave something exactly where it was. "Yes," she said. "Interference artifacts." She left. Soarath stood at his window and looked at Earth turning in the morning's darkness. He thought about the file, the wars, the burning atmosphere, the stubborn, unreasonable persistence. He thought about Okafor walking into the receiving bay and smiling at 30 meters of engineered intimidation as though it were a particularly nice piece of furniture. He thought about the thermos, dented at the bottom from years of use, sitting on the table beside the instruments of 4 centuries of interstellar law. He thought about 7 anomalies in the outer system that the scanner had looked at 3 times and refused to explain. And then he straightened his jacket and went to breakfast, because he had done this 11 times and he knew how it went. It went the same way every time. He told himself that twice on the walk to the dining hall. It helped less than it usually did. Day 2 began the way day 1 had ended, quietly, without drama, without any of the signals that Soarath had learned over 4 centuries to read as warning signs. That, he was beginning to understand, was itself a warning sign. He arrived at the negotiating room before the human delegation. He always arrived first. It was a habit built over 11 first contacts. The host nation sat first, composed and waiting, and the new civilization entered into a room that was already settled, already certain. The room told them something before a single word was spoken. He sat. Lys sat to his right. The rest of the conclave delegation filled in behind them. They waited. The humans arrived 4 minutes later. Not late. 4 minutes was within the agreed window. But there was something in the ease with which they came through the door that Soarath could not file under any existing category. They did not look like people entering a room that held their future. They looked like people arriving at a meeting they had called themselves. Okafor set his thermos on the table, opened his notebook, clicked his pen. "Good morning," he said, and meant it simply, and they began. The second day was about territory. Specifically, it was about Earth's solar system, what the Conclave's membership terms classified as a new member's home space, the region within which a new species retained primary jurisdiction, and the boundaries at which Conclave law began to apply. It was, in Soarath's experience, always the day that got difficult. Young civilizations clung to their home space the way living things clung to warmth. It was instinct more than logic. The solar system was everything they had ever known. The idea of drawing lines through it, of saying this far and no further belongs to you, produced a kind of grief in new members that they rarely named out loud, but that sat in the room like weather. Okafor discussed it the way a man discusses property lines with a surveyor. Professionally, specifically, without grief. He had questions, good ones, precise ones, the kind that came from someone who had read the Conclave's territorial framework carefully and found its edges. He pushed back on the boundary at the outer system. Not emotionally. He simply pointed to a clause in the framework, referenced a precedent from the Conclave's admission of a species called the Soarath some 2 centuries ago, and suggested that the boundary as written did not match the precedent as applied. Soarath's legal delegate looked at the precedent. The precedent said what Okafor said it said. The boundary was adjusted. Okafor wrote something in his notebook. Moved on. By midday, they had covered territorial jurisdiction, communication protocols, and the framework for resource sharing in the asteroid belt. Soarath watched the humans work and felt the professional part of him, the 400-year part, the part that had done this 11 times, quietly revising its initial assessment. The file had called humans an unpredictable species. Unpredictable was the wrong word. Prepared was the word. It was in the early afternoon, during a discussion of mutual defense obligations, that Okafor first mentioned it. He was walking through a clause about the Conclave's collective security guarantee, the promise that all member species contributed to and benefited from a shared defensive framework. He was asking about response times, specifically how long it took for Conclave forces to reach a member world under threat. Soarath answered. It varied by location and threat level, but the standard mobilization window was 40 to 60 standard days. Okafor listened, wrote something, then said in the same level tone he used for everything, "That's useful context. We'll need to consider how that interacts with the deployment range of the defensive fleet." Then he moved on to the next clause. Much Soarath let it pass. The defensive fleet. Earth had a fleet. Most species had some form of military capability. It was not unusual. He filed it and continued. The afternoon session ended at 1700 hours. The humans collected their papers and notebooks with the same unhurried efficiency with which they had arrived. Okafor capped his pen, picked up his thermos. At the door, Admiral Chen paused. She looked back at the room, at the table, the data screens, the ranked conclave delegation, with an expression that was not quite readable. Then she left. Soarath sat for a moment in the empty room after they had gone. He was thinking about the word defensive. People described their military in particular ways. The word they chose was rarely accidental. Young civilizations, frightened civilizations, would call their forces defense forces. It was a way of signaling that they meant no aggression. Please do not destroy us. It was a posture. Okafor had not said it as a posture. He had said it as a fact, a category. The way you would say the medical team or the engineering department, a thing that existed with a function, with a name, unremarkable in its existence. Soarath called Liss into the room. Pull whatever intelligence we have on human military capability, he said. Full review. Liss nodded. Left. He sat alone a little longer. Outside, through the window, at the far end of the room, Earth turned. Liss brought the intelligence review to his quarters that night. It was not a short file. The Conclave's advanced scouts had been watching Earth for 30 years, long before the decision to make formal contact. 30 years of passive observation, communication intercepts, energy signature mapping, population and industrial assessments. The file on human military capability ran to 11,000 pages. He read the summary. Earth maintained what its own communications called a unified planetary defense network, the result of a global military integration treaty signed 40 years ago, which had merged the armed forces of Earth's largest nations into a single command structure. On paper, it was impressive for a species at their developmental level. Several thousand surface-to-orbit weapons platforms, a few hundred orbital defense stations, a small fleet of what the intercepts called patrol vessels, ships capable of operating within the solar system, not beyond it. What the patrol vessels were the largest human spacecraft the Conclave scouts had detected. Soarath looked at the patrol vessel specifications. They were, by Conclave standards, modest, fast perhaps, heavily armed for their size, but small. The kind of ship a young civilization built when it was first learning what space required of a warship. Practical, functional, and nowhere near the scale of what the Conclave fielded. He closed the file. He slept better that night than the night before. He told himself this was because the intelligence review had settled the question. He did not examine this thought too closely. Day 3 was complicated. It began normally. Okafor arrived with his thermos and his notebook. Admiral Chen took her seat and placed her hands flat on the table and began her daily inventory of the Conclave delegation with her steady, patient eyes. The wrist screen pulsed. She glanced at it. The glance lasted less than 1 second. Her expression did not change. They covered legal jurisdiction, which of Earth's internal laws remained sovereign, which yielded to conclave frameworks, and where the boundary between the two sat. It was detailed work. There were 17 subclauses, and each one required discussion. Soarath had done this 11 times. He knew where the points of friction were. He knew which clauses young civilizations pushed back on hardest. The ones that touched their courts, their internal disputes, their right to govern themselves according to their own history. Okafor pushed back on 3 of them. He was right on 2. Technically, precisely, with references that his legal team had clearly prepared in advance. He accepted the 3rd with a brief nod, which told Soarath that he had known it would not hold, had raised it anyway, had noted the response, and had filed it. At the midpoint of the afternoon, during a discussion of the Conclave's collective economic framework, Okafor glanced at something in his notebook and said, without any particular emphasis, we'd also want to understand how the framework applies to assets positioned in the outer system, specifically in relation to the defensive fleet's operational range. Second mention, Soarath made a small note of his own. Continued. By the end of day 3, the major structural points of the membership agreement were mostly resolved. And the remaining items were detailed, important but technical, the kind of work that legal teams did in the margins while the senior diplomats confirmed the shape of the thing. Soarath walked back to his quarters and felt, for the first time in this negotiation, something close to his normal professional satisfaction. The shape was right. The framework was agreed. 9 days, maybe 10. He had done it again. Then Liz came to his door. "I have a question," she said. He waited. "The intelligence file, the patrol vessels." She held her data screen with both hands, the way she held things when she was careful. "The energy signatures we cataloged. What about them?" "They match the propulsion profile of the patrol vessels, yes." She paused. "They also match something else. If you scale the profile up by a factor of approximately 800. Soarath looked at her. "The anomalies in the outer system," he said. "I did not say that." "Liz." She looked at her screen, then at him, then at a point somewhere between the two, which was where she looked when she was choosing her words with great care. "The anomalies in the outer system were logged as interference artifacts," she said. "I am not revising that classification. I am only noting that there is a mathematical relationship between the two energy signatures that I thought you should be aware of." "What is the scale factor again?" 800. He sat down. He sat there for a moment, doing the arithmetic that he did not want to do and getting the answer that he did not want to get. If the anomalies in the outer system were ships, and they were not, they were interference artifacts, he had decided this. And if those ships used the same propulsion technology as the human patrol vessels, simply scaled, then what was sitting beyond the ice giants, in the dark unmoving, was not a patrol vessel, was not anything the Conclave's vocabulary had a word for. 800, he said again. "That is the factor, yes. The Conclave's largest warship would be a factor of approximately 60, Liz said. "If that comparison is relevant, which I am not suggesting it is." She left. Soarath sat in his quarters and looked at his hands for a while. Outside the window, Earth's night side was below him, dark, lit here and there by the gathered light of cities. The evidence of 7 billion people going about their evening as though 43 Conclave ships were not sitting above their heads. Or perhaps because those ships were. Or perhaps, and this was the thought he sat with longest in the quiet of his quarters, in the dark, perhaps the ships above their heads were not the largest thing in the solar system. He pulled the scan data again. The 7 anomalies. He looked at them for a long time. He looked at their positions, stable, precise, evenly distributed through the outer system in a pattern that did not resemble natural formations, a pattern that resembled a perimeter. He closed the scan data. He sat. On the morning of day 4, Soarath arrived at the negotiating room before the humans. He sat. He composed himself. He was 400 years old and had absorbed 11 civilizations, and he knew what he was doing, and he knew how this went. The humans arrived. Okafor set down his thermos. Admiral Chen's wrist screen pulsed once, and she looked at it with the expression of someone checking whether a flight was on time. They worked through 2 subclauses of the economic framework. Good progress, efficient. Then Okafor paused mid-sentence, checked something in his notebook, and said, "Before we continue on the matter of the outer system boundary, given the defensive fleet's standard patrol range, we'd want a clause that clarifies the boundary applies to Conclave vessels, not to Earth defense assets operating within their normal range." 4th time, Soarath set down his pen. "Secretary General," he said. Okafor looked up. "You've mentioned the defensive fleet 4 times over 3 days." Okafor said nothing. He waited in the patient way he waited for everything. "Our intelligence assessment of Earth's military capability includes approximately 300 patrol-class vessels," Soarath said. "Standard solar system range. I would not characterize that as requiring a special clause." Okafor looked at him. The silence lasted 3 seconds. It felt much longer. "The defensive fleet," Okafor said, with no change in his voice whatsoever, "is not the patrol vessels." He wrote something in his notebook. "We can address the clause tomorrow," he said, and moved on to the next item. Soarath did not move to the next item. He sat very still. He looked at Okafor, who was already reading the next clause, pen moving. He looked at Admiral Chen, who was looking at her wrist screen with the expression of a person checking whether a flight was on time. The flight, Soarath understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, had already landed. It had landed some time ago. They had just not told him. The morning of day 4 had the kind of quiet that sits wrong. Soarath noticed it when he woke. Not in the room. The ship was exactly as it always was. The low hum of its systems, the precise recycled air, the soft light that the sovereign patience produced without variation or mood. The quiet was inside him. The particular quiet of a mind that has been thinking about something all night without naming it, and wakes up still thinking about it, still refusing to name it. He dressed. He went to breakfast. He ate without tasting anything. Though Liz arrived at the table halfway through and sat across from him and said nothing, which was how Liz communicated that she had nothing good to say. He looked at her. The outer system anomalies, he said, still unresolved. Have you run a structural analysis? She looked at her hands. I ran 3. He waited. The results were not consistent with natural formations, she said, or with interference artifacts. She paused. They were consistent with constructed objects of significant mass, positioned at regular intervals along a perimeter, approximately 12 astronomical units from the central star. 12 astronomical units. Just beyond the orbit of the largest gas giant, a position that covered every approach vector to the inner system. A position Soarath thought that someone had chosen deliberately. Okay, how long have they been there, he said. We can't determine that from passive scanning. She looked at him. We would need to ping them actively to get a timeline. No active scans, he said immediately. Not without cause. No, she agreed, not without cause. They sat for a moment with the food between them, cooling on the table. They have been there at least as long as we have been in this system, Liz said quietly. That is all I can say with certainty. He stood, picked up his jacket, put it on. Thank you, Liz, he said. She nodded, in the way she nodded when she had nothing else to offer, and he walked to the negotiating room to do what he had done 11 times and intended to do a 12th, because he knew how this went, and the answer to not knowing something was to continue doing the thing he knew. The humans arrived on time. Okafor with his thermos and his notebook and his face that had been through things and come out settled on the other side. Admiral Chen with her flat hands and her steady inventory eyes. The legal delegates, the scientific advisors, the man whose role was never explained. They sat. For the first 90 minutes of day 4, everything was normal. They worked through the final sub-clauses of the economic framework. 2 were agreed without discussion. 1 required 20 minutes of back and forth between the legal teams, a reference to 3 separate precedents, and an eventual compromise that both sides could accept. Okafor wrote in his notebook. His pen moved with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who was comfortable in this room, with this work, at this pace. Admiral Chen's wrist screen pulsed. She looked at it. Her hands stayed flat on the table. Her expression did not move. But something very small, something Soarath caught only because he had spent 400 years watching faces at negotiating tables, shifted behind her eyes. Not alarm. Recognition. She glanced at Okafor. 1 glance, 1 second. Less than 1 second. And Okafor, who was in the middle of a sentence about resource allocation clauses, did not look back at her, did not pause, did not change his tone at all. But his hand, the one holding the pen, stopped writing. For exactly 4 seconds, the pen rested on the paper without moving. Then it continued. Soarath watched this and felt something move through him that he did not have a comfortable name for. 40 minutes later, Okafor paused mid-discussion. Excuse me for a moment, he said. For he was already rising from his seat, already moving toward the door. Not rushing, but moving with a new and quiet purpose that was different from his usual stillness. 5 minutes. He was gone 12. The room sat in a particular kind of silence during those 12 minutes. The conclave delegation did not speak to each other. There was nothing to say that did not involve acknowledging the thing no one was acknowledging. The human delegates remained at the table. The legal team reviewed documents with concentrated attention that seemed slightly too concentrated. The scientific advisors talked quietly between themselves in low voices that were not meant to carry. Admiral Chen sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at a point on the wall 6 inches above the door Okafor had walked through. Her wrist screen did not pulse again. Entering whatever it had needed to tell her, it had already told her. 12 minutes. The door opened. Okafor came back through it and walked to his chair and sat down with the same settled, unhurried quality he had walked in with on day one. He picked up his thermos, poured a cup, set the thermos back in its place beside the Conclave's instruments. He looked at Soarath. "Sorry," he said. "Where were we?" They found where they were. They continued. For 40 more minutes, the negotiation moved forward. Clauses were agreed. Points were noted. Okafor's pen moved in his notebook. The room continued to be a room where diplomats talked, because that was what the room was for, and that was what diplomats did. Soarath did not look at Admiral Chen's wrist screen. He did not look at the man whose role was never explained, who had shifted slightly forward in his seat, almost imperceptibly, with a quality that was not tension, but was something adjacent to readiness. He did not think about 12 minutes. He thought about the clause in front of him. Then, at 11:47, every sensor on the Sovereign Patience woke up at once. Not an alert. Soarath had heard alerts, targeted sounds, specific frequencies, designed to indicate specific threats. This was different. This was the sound of a system encountering something that did not fit any of its existing categories and trying to fit it anyway, producing in the attempt a kind of electronic distress that was almost organic. Every instrument on his wrist panel lit simultaneously. Across the fleet, he could hear it, a cascade of the same signal, ship to ship, nearly 43 vessels all registering the same object at the same moment, all returning the same result. The result was insufficient data, cannot classify, cannot measure, cannot. Out past the orbit of the outermost planet, at the edge of the solar system, something had come out of fold space. Fold space exits had signatures. Soarath knew them well. The ripple in local space-time, the electromagnetic burst, the brief gravitational fluctuation that every folding drive produced when it stopped folding. He had cataloged them for 40 years. A conclave destroyer produced a signature of a specific size. A conclave carrier produced a larger one. The largest ship ever built by any species in the known galaxy produced a signature that the instruments rated as significant. The signature at the edge of the solar system was not significant. So the instruments did not have a word for what it was. His fleet analyst sent a message. Short, direct, stripped of everything except the number. Mass estimate, 4.2 billion metric tons. Confidence rating, 11%. He read it twice. The confidence rating of 11% meant the instruments did not trust their own reading. But 11% confidence on a number that large still produced a lower bound, a floor, that sat somewhere that Soarath had not previously imagined a floor could sit. He looked up from his wrist panel. Across the table, Okafor was looking at him. He had not looked at his wrist screen. He had not looked at Admiral Chen. He was simply looking at Soarath with the same settled, patient expression he had worn for 4 days. The expression of a man who had already made his peace with every outcome. But Admiral Chen had permitted herself a small smile. It lasted approximately half a second. Then it was gone, and her face was as flat and professional as it always was, and her hands were flat on the table. The Sovereign Patience was a ship that had been built to be certain. Its walls were designed not to tremble. Its systems were designed not to confuse. It had been built to project authority into the silence of space and fill that silence with the weight of 400 years of conclave history. It was trembling now, not physically. The hull was solid, the decks were stable, the recycled air was as precise as always. But the instruments were producing outputs that conflicted with each other, that revised themselves in real time. So that kept adjusting the mass estimate upward by increments as the scanners found more of the object to measure. The object was moving, slowly, deliberately, in no hurry at all, toward the inner system, toward Earth, toward the Sovereign Patience in its 43 ships. His communications officer sent a message. The object is broadcasting on standard conclave frequencies, human language. The broadcast is a single phrase, repeated. He read the phrase, UES Unbroken, Earth Defense Fleet. Arriving on schedule. On schedule. He read those two words and sat with them for a long moment in the ringing, overwhelmed silence of his own mind. On schedule. Okafor had excused himself for 12 minutes. The fleet analyst sent another message, shorter than the last. 2 words. We can't. The message ended there. He never sent a third. Soarath looked across the table. Okafor had picked up his thermos while he was reading his messages. He was refilling his cup. The pour was slow and steady, the kind of pour that did not shake, did not rush, did not spill. The kind of pour that came from hands that had been through enough that they had learned how to be still. He set the thermos down. He looked at Soarath. Outside the long window at the far end of the room, the stars were as they had always been. Fixed, cold, indifferent. But at the edge of the sensor range, something was moving through them. Something that the Conclave's instruments had tried to measure 3 times and revised upward every time, and which was still too far away to see with anything but numbers that refused to sit still. Should we continue? Okafor said. His voice was the same as it had been on day 1. Low, unhurried, no performance in it at all. Soarath looked at him. He looked at the thermos on the table, dented, ordinary, sitting beside the precision instruments of 4 centuries of interstellar law with the total ease of something that belonged there. He looked at Admiral Chen, whose hands were flat on the table and whose face was professional and still, and who had permitted herself half a second of a smile and then put it away because she did not need it anymore. He thought about the file, 11,000 pages of 30 years of observation. He thought about the patrol vessels, the small, fast, practical ships the scouts had cataloged. Ships that used a propulsion system that, if you scaled it by a factor of approximately 800, it produced the energy signature of something that the instruments out at the edge of the solar system were still trying and failing to fully measure. He thought about the 7 anomalies in the outer system, positioned at regular intervals along a perimeter. He thought about, on schedule. The object out past the ice giants was not rushing. It was not making a dramatic entrance. It was arriving in the way that things arrived when they had been expected, when the appointment had been made long ago, when the date had been set, when the only question had ever been whether the other party would show up on time. The other party had shown up on time. Okafor refilled his cup. Should we continue? He said again. And Soarath, who had absorbed 11 civilizations and who had known for 4 centuries exactly where the most powerful thing in any room was standing, said, yes. He said it because it was the only thing left to say. And they continued. It took 6 hours to arrive. 6 hours during which the negotiation continued. Because Okafor had asked if they should continue, and Soarath had said yes. And the thing about yes was that once you said it, you were committed to what came after it. So they continued. They worked through the last 3 clauses of the economic framework and 2 preliminary clauses of the mutual defense agreement, and Okafor's pen moved in his notebook, and the legal teams exchanged documents, and the surface of the room was exactly what a negotiating room was supposed to be. Below the surface, Soarath's fleet was falling apart. Well, not physically. The ships held their positions, the hulls were intact. The crews were at their stations doing what crews did. But the reports coming to his wrist panel told a story that had no comfortable ending. A stream of assessments and reassessments from 43 ships all trying to process the same incoming data and all arriving at the same result, which was that their instruments were not equal to what they were being asked to measure. The object had a designation now. The Conclave's computers had pulled it from the broadcast. UES Unbroken. United Earthship. They had searched their intelligence files for the name. Found nothing. 30 years of surveillance of Earth's military communications and the name Unbroken appeared nowhere in any of it. Not in budget documents, not in construction manifests, and not in the technical communications between human engineering teams that the scouts had been monitoring for 2 decades. It had been built in silence, or it had been built somewhere the scouts had not been watching, or, and this was the thought Soarath sat with, while Okafor discussed mutual defense response windows. Both. The mass estimate kept revising. Every 15 minutes, his fleet analyst sent a new number, each one larger than the last. each one accompanied by a confidence rating that refused to climb above 22% because the instruments kept finding more of the object than they had found before, kept measuring new sections of it, kept discovering that what they thought was the edge was not the edge. At the third hour, his fleet analyst stopped sending estimates. He sent one message instead. Sir, I need you to understand that the numbers I am producing are not errors. I have checked the instruments 4 times. I have cross-referenced against all 43 ships in the fleet. The readings are consistent. What I am about to tell you is what is actually out there. Then he sent the final estimate. Val Soarath read it. He set his wrist panel face down on the table. He listened to Okafor discuss the legal definition of defensive engagement for approximately 4 minutes without hearing a single word. Then he turned his wrist panel back over and read the number again, in case he had misread it the first time. He had not misread it. It came into visual range at the 5th hour. The Sovereign Patience had observation windows along its command deck. Long, wide panels of reinforced composite that showed the actual sky rather than a screen rendering of it. Val Soarath had stood at those windows many times. He had watched stars from them. He had watched planets. He had watched once a star go into its final collapse from a distance close enough that the light had been uncomfortable. He stood at the window now with List beside him and watched the Unbroken arrive. It came in from the outer system along the solar plane, moving at a speed that was unhurried and deliberate. And as it came closer, the scale of it assembled itself in his vision. The way large things assembled themselves, first as a smudge, then as a shape that kept being larger than expected every time he tried to fix its edges. How the way mountains looked when you drove toward them, and they kept being further away than they should be for how big they were. It was not shaped like a warship. He had expected a warship. Every civilization's military aesthetic converged sooner or later on the same basic forms. The long hull, the weapon emplacements, the hard geometry of something built to project force. He had seen warships from 9 different species. They were all at some level recognizable as the same idea expressed in different materials. The Unbroken did not look like that. It looked like a city that had decided after long consideration that it was tired of staying still. It had the basic, elongated form of a large vessel, but everything else about it resisted the category. There were structures along its hull that were the size of the Sovereign Patience and appeared to be component sections, not weapons, not engine nacelles, but whole subsections of a larger whole, each one enormous in itself, each one part of something larger by an order of magnitude that his eyes kept refusing to fully accept. There were tiers to it, layers, places where the hull stepped back and revealed internal structures behind it that were themselves the size of small stations. The point defense arrays were visible from this distance. That was the detail that landed hardest. The point defense arrays, the close-range defensive weapons that every warship carried for dealing with incoming fire, were visible as distinct structures from a distance at which the Sovereign Patience itself would have been a small shape in the sky. Where Val Soarath looked at the Sovereign Patience's own point defense arrays, then back at the Unbroken's, Liz was very quiet beside him. "The comparison is not favorable," she said at last. He did not answer because the comparison was so far beyond not favorable that the phrase seemed to belong to a different conversation about a different scale of thing. At the 6th hour, the Unbroken reached a position 30,000 kilometers from Earth and stopped. It stopped with the absolute total stillness of something that had always intended to stop there. Not the deceleration of a ship arriving, but the settling of something taking up a position it had decided on in advance. Its drive signature dropped to 0. It sat 30,000 kilometers from Earth, 20,000 kilometers from the Conclave Fleet's forward position. His tactical officer sent a message. "Point defense arrays on the Unbroken are tracking us." Then 6 seconds later, "Passive tracking only. No active targeting. They are watching us the way you watch something you do not consider a threat." Val Soarath read that last sentence twice. The way you watch something you do not consider a threat. He thought about that. He thought about what it meant to have a ship the size of a continent sit 20,000 kilometers from your fleet and look at you the way you looked at weather. Not with aggression, not with hostility, just with the steady, patient attention of something that had already decided the outcome. The Sovereign Patience was the largest ship in the Conclave Fleet. It had a crew of 12,000. It carried weapons capable of sterilizing a planetary surface from orbit. It had been built to be the most powerful thing in any room it entered. It had never, in 40 years of service, been in a room where it was not the most powerful thing. It was in that room now. He went back to the negotiating room. Okafor was there. He had not left during the 6 hours. He had stayed at the table through every session break, refilling his cup, reading documents, occasionally writing something in his notebook. When Soarath came through the door, he looked up with the settled patience he always had, as though the last 6 hours had been entirely ordinary. "Ambassador," he said. Soarath sat down. He sat for a moment without speaking. He was composing himself the way you compose yourself after a long fall. Not a fall from a height, but the long, slow fall of certainty giving way. The fall that happens inside you when something you have relied on for 400 years turns out to have an edge you did not see. "The unbroken," he said. Okafor waited. "Tell me about it." Okafor looked at him for a moment. Then he closed his notebook, set his pen beside it. The gesture was small, the first time in 4 days that his hands had been empty of anything at the table. "The Unbroken was commissioned 18 years ago," he said. "She was the first of her class. There are currently 4 vessels of her class in active service." Soarath sat with that. 18 years ago. The Conclave's long-range scouts had first detected anomalous energy signatures from Earth's outer system 19 years ago. They had spent a year analyzing the data, confirming it was a civilized species, filing the recommendation for formal contact. Then the contact protocols had taken another 4 years to work through the Conclave's own bureaucracy. Humanity had known they were coming for 18 years. "She is not your most advanced vessel," Soarath said. It was not quite a question. "She is the 4th oldest vessel in the Earth Defense Fleet," Okafor said. "We have 3 older, 12 younger. Some of the younger ones are—" He paused, not to find the word, to decide whether to say it. "Different." The room was very quiet. Soarath looked at Okafor, at the settled face, the bedrock face, the face that had been through things and come out on the other side neither broken nor hard. He looked at the thermos on the table. He looked at his own hands. "Why?" he said. Okafor looked at him. "Why build it? Why build all of it and tell no one? Why walk into these negotiations with a notebook and a thermos and never mention—" He stopped. He was not sure how to finish the sentence. He was not sure what the end of the sentence was. Okafor was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he looked at the window. Outside, the stars were as they always were. But 20,000 kilometers away, something the size of a city was sitting in the dark and watching with the patient attention of something that had already decided the outcome. When Okafor spoke, his voice was exactly what it had always been. Low, unhurried, with no performance in it at all. "We spent 10,000 years doing this to each other," he said. "We got very good at it." He looked at Soarath. "When you appeared on our sensors, we had a decision to make. A pause, the length of a breath. And we decided we would only have that conversation once." The room held those words. Soarath did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than the silence that followed. And he had enough experience to know when silence was the correct response. He thought about 11 civilizations. He thought about the script, the fleet, the ceremony, the engineered architecture of the receiving bay, the 9 days, the signature on the crystal, the absorption. 11 times. The same shape every time. Because the shape was a fact of how things worked in the universe. The shape was not a fact. The shape was a habit. The shape was a habit built on a premise, that the conclave was always the most powerful thing in the room. And the premise had just been quietly, completely, and permanently removed. He had been sitting in this room for 4 days. He had arrived with 43 ships and 4 centuries of certainty. He had read the file and found a messy, persistent species that had survived its own worst instincts through stubborn, unreasonable luck. He had been looking at it wrong. It was not luck. It was practice. Humanity had spent 10,000 years being the most dangerous thing in their own world. They had built the weapons. They had burned the cities. They had survived every version of themselves that had tried to be the last version. And when something appeared on their sensors that might be bigger than all of that, they had not panicked. They had not prayed. They had not pointed their existing weapons at the sky and hoped. They had gone to work, in silence, for 18 years. Soarath thought about the file. 11,000 pages, 30 years of surveillance, the patrol vessels, the orbital stations, the careful, practical, first-generation military infrastructure of a species learning what space required of a warship. They had shown the scouts exactly what they wanted shown. They had built everything else somewhere else. He thought about Okafor walking into the receiving bay on day one. 30 meters of engineered intimidation, the ceiling built to make visitors feel small, 43 conclave diplomats arranged to suggest the weight of history, and smiling the small, real smile. I see what you've built here. It's fine. He had thought that smile was ease. He had thought it was confidence born from not understanding the size of what it was looking at. It was not that. It was the smile of a man who was sitting across the table from the second largest thing in the room and knew it. Outside the window, the Unbroken sat in the dark. Its running lights were on, long lines of light along its hull sections that made its scale visible in a way that the darkness would otherwise have hidden. At this distance, it was not a shape so much as a pattern of lights too large to hold all at once in a single field of view. Soarath looked at it. He was not afraid of many things. 4 centuries produced either wisdom or the kind of experience that made fear seem inefficient, and he had always believed it was wisdom. He understood now that it was experience. He was afraid, not of the ship, not of the weapons, not of the point defense arrays tracking his fleet with the idle attention of something that had better things to worry about. He was afraid of what the ship represented, which was not a weapon, but a choice. The choice to spend 18 years building an answer to a question in silence, to walk into a negotiation with a thermos and a notebook, to mention the fleet 4 times in 4 days in the tone of voice you used for things everyone in the room already knew, to wait with absolute patience for the moment when the other party finally understood. The choice said, we are not desperate. We are not afraid. We have already decided how this ends, and we are sitting here giving you the opportunity to decide the same thing. He sat at the table across from Okafor for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. Where were we? He said. Okafor looked at him. Something in the settled face shifted. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. Something that might have been, in a different face, relief. He opened his notebook. Mutual defense obligations, he said. Clause 14. They continued. Day 5 began differently. Not in the way the room looked. The table was the same. The chairs were the same. The long window with the stars beyond it was the same. Not in the way the humans arrived. Okafor still came through the door with his thermos and his notebook, still sat with the same settled quality, still clicked his pen with the same unhurried sound. Not in any detail that could be pointed to and named, but the room was different. Soarath felt it the moment he sat down. The weight of the room had shifted, while not toward the humans. It had not swung from one side to the other the way power usually swung, dramatically with noise and performance. It had simply redistributed itself into a new shape, a shape that was not about one side being larger than the other, but about 2 parties sitting at a table who both knew, now, exactly what they were sitting across from. That was the difference. For 4 days, only one side had known. Now both did. Okafor spoke first. He set his pen down beside his notebook, the same gesture he had made at the end of their conversation the day before, hands empty of everything. And he looked at Soarath with the direct, patient attention that was simply his face, his natural face. Not a diplomatic construction, but the actual expression of a man who had been paying attention for a very long time. I want to make something clear, he said. Soarath waited. The Unbroken is here because we asked her to be here, because this meeting is significant, and the Earth Defense Fleet marks significant things. He paused. She is not here as a threat. Soarath looked at him. He thought about saying several things. He thought about saying, a ship of that size is a threat by existing. He thought about saying, the distinction between presence and threat becomes difficult at that scale. He thought about saying, you mentioned it 4 times before it arrived and you said it calmly every time, which is perhaps the most threatening thing of all. He said, I understand. Okafor nodded, picked up his pen. Then let's talk about the treaty, he said. The treaty Okafor proposed was not the treaty Soarath had brought with him. He had brought the standard Conclave membership agreement, the same document, updated and refined over 4 centuries, that 11 civilizations had signed. It was a thorough document. It was a fair document in its way. It offered real protections, real resources, real access to 400 years of accumulated knowledge and infrastructure. What it asked in return was significant but not unreasonable. Legal integration, resource sharing, the surrender of unilateral military action, a place within the Conclave's existing framework, a place within, inside, absorbed. Okafor's proposal used a different word, partnership. He laid it out in the same direct, organized way he laid out everything, without drama, without the weight of performance, just the clean structure of a man who had thought carefully about what he wanted and was now saying it. Equal standing, mutual defense, full sovereignty retained on both sides. No absorption-averse legal system into the Conclave's framework. Instead, a joint framework, built together, applicable to the relationship between the 2 parties and to any other parties who chose to join it later. No joining something that already existed, building something new, together. Soarath listened to all of it. He let the full shape of it assemble in his mind before he responded. He was 400 years old and he had learned, somewhere in the middle centuries, that the most important moments in a negotiation were the ones where you said nothing for long enough to actually understand what had just been said. When what had just been said was, we will not be absorbed. What had just been said was, we are not applying for membership. We are proposing a merger. What had just been said was the thing that had been true since day one, stated plainly at last, after 5 days of tea and patience and a notebook full of careful handwriting. We are not the junior party in this room. He looked at Okafor. He thought about 11 civilizations, about the script, about the way it always went. The same shape, the same 9 days, the same crystal medium with the signatures on it. He thought about 4 centuries of certainty and what certainty felt like from the inside, how warm it was, how much space it took up, how much room it left for actually looking at what was in front of you. Well, he thought about a ship the size of a city sitting 20,000 kilometers away in the dark, its running lights on, its point defense arrays tracking his fleet with the idle patience of something that had already decided the outcome. He thought, the Conclave has 47 member species. He thought, none of them arrived like this. The Conclave's council will need to review this framework, he said. Of course, Okafor said. We'd expect that. It will take time. We have time. He refilled his cup. We've had time. They spent the rest of the morning working through the structure of the partnership framework, not the fine legal detail, which would take teams of specialists months to build properly, but the shape of it, the principles. What each side was committing to at the level of intention before the lawyers came in and built the walls and the floors. It was, in its way, the best negotiation Soarath had participated in a century. Not the easiest, not the most comfortable, but the best, the kind where both parties were fully present, where both sides had something real at stake, where no one was performing confidence they did not have because there was no longer any need for performance. The room was what it was. The table held what it held. 2 parties, both of them knowing exactly what the other was, talking about what came next. Okafor was precise and flexible in the way that prepared people were flexible. He knew which parts of his proposal mattered and which parts were negotiating room, and he navigated between them without announcing which was which. Soarath had to find the edges himself, and that was, he admitted privately, more interesting than anything that had happened at a negotiating table in years. Admiral Chen said 3 words during the entire morning session. She said them to Okafor quietly during a break, and Okafor nodded once and made a note. Whatever the 3 words were, they had been enough. The man whose role was never explained sat where he always sat and watched with calm and simple attention. By midday, the shape was agreed. The signing was that afternoon. The Conclave had brought its standard equipment for treaty formalization. Quantum-encoded crystal media, dual biometric readers, a digital notarization system that produced a record stored simultaneously in 17 secure locations across Conclave space. It was thorough. It was, in its way, beautiful, the product of 4 centuries of making things permanent. Okafor looked at it. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a pen and a sheet of paper. Actual paper, the pressed wood pulp kind, the kind humans had been writing on for thousands of years before they had anything better, and had apparently kept writing on even after they had something better, out of habit or stubbornness or the particular human attachment to things that had been around long enough to feel true. He set the paper on the table. He said, without any apology or explanation, "Our copy." His legal delegate produced a second sheet. Conclave copy. Soarath looked at the 2 sheets of paper. He looked at the quantum-encoded crystal system beside them, where he thought about the 11 treaties he had signed on crystal media. All of them stored in 17 locations, all of them permanent, all of them correct. He picked up Okafor's pen. It was an ordinary ballpoint, the kind that used actual liquid ink, that left actual marks in actual pigment on actual pressed plant matter. A technology so old it predated space travel by centuries. A technology so simple that any child could use it, and any adult had used it so many times they had stopped noticing it. He signed his name on the first sheet, then on the second. Okafor signed beside him. His signature was small and neat and quick. The signature of a man who had signed his name on a great many things and had no particular feeling about the act itself, only about what the act meant. Liss witnessed. Admiral Chen witnessed. And the man whose role was never explained witnessed. Soarath handed the pen back. Okafor capped it and put it in his jacket pocket. The thing was done. Afterward, when the session had formally closed and the human delegation was collecting their papers and notebooks for the last time, Soarath stood at the window. Outside, the Unbroken was still there, still sitting in the dark at 30,000 kilometers, its running lights still on, still tracking the Conclave Fleet with the patient attention of something with nowhere it needed to be. It had not moved in 24 hours. It would not move, he understood now, until the human delegation left. And then it would move with them, and it would go back to wherever it had come from. And the darkness it left behind would be exactly the same darkness that had been there before. When except that it would not feel the same anymore. He heard the door behind him. He did not turn. Footsteps crossed the room and stopped a few feet away. He knew without looking that it was Okafor. They stood at the window together for a moment. Outside, the Unbroken held its position. Soarath looked at its running lights, the long lines of them along the hull sections, too many to count, too spread out to hold in one look. He thought about the people inside it. 12,000 people, perhaps more. People who had been out here in the dark for how long? How long had it been in transit to arrive here when it had arrived, on schedule, at exactly the moment Okafor's wrist screen had pulsed? How long was she traveling, Shermas, he said. 11 days, Okafor said. So she had been sent before the negotiations began. I sent before either side had any certainty about how the negotiations would go. Sent with the simple instruction to arrive at a specific time, at a specific position, and wait. You were always going to have her here, Soarath said. Yes. Regardless of how the talks went. Okafor was quiet for a moment. We wanted you to meet her, he said, one way or another. Soarath turned that over. He thought about what it meant, to send a ship that size not as a threat, not as a last resort, but as an introduction. This is what we are. We thought you should know. The same logic as the thermos on the table, the notebook, the jazz on the approach frequency. All of it the same thing. We are not performing anything for you. We are showing you what is actually true. She's impressive, he said, and because it was the truest and most insufficient thing he could think of to say. Okafor looked at the ship for a moment. She's home, he said. And then he said good evening, and he walked back across the room and through the door, and Soarath stood at the window alone. The human shuttle left at 1900 hours. Soarath stood on the observation deck of the Sovereign Patience and watched it go, the small, unmarked ship descending through the gap between the Conclave Fleet and the planet below, trailing nothing, broadcasting nothing, carrying 7 people back to the world they had come from. The Unbroken waited until the shuttle had cleared the fleet's perimeter. Then it moved. Not fast, not dramatically. It turned. And the turning of something that large was itself an event, a slow and total reorientation that took several minutes to complete. And when it was done, it began to accelerate, back toward the outer system, back toward the dark, in no hurry at all. He watched it go until it was a shape, and then a smaller shape, and then a pattern of lights too far away to distinguish individually. Then it was gone. The space it had occupied looked exactly the same as all the space around it. He stood there for a while after it was gone. He went to his quarters. He sat at the desk he had not used for anything personal in 5 days. Everything had been wrist panels and briefing tables and the ongoing living work of the negotiation. And he opened his official log, the one he had kept for 4 centuries, the one that had the records of 11 first contacts, each one following the same template, each one noting the species, the date, the terms, the outcome. He looked at the template for a long time. Then he began to type. He wrote the species designation. He wrote the date of first contact. He wrote the name of the lead human negotiator and the name of the treaty that had been signed and the basic terms of the partnership framework that both sides had agreed to in principle pending council review. Then he got to the section marked assessment. He stopped. He had filled this section 11 times. Each entry was thorough, a complete professional assessment of the species in question, their developmental level, their integration potential, their likely contribution to conclave resources and infrastructure, their adjustment period projections. Each one had taken him an hour to write. Each one had said, in different forms and different specifics, essentially the same thing. Another civilization, absorbed, added to the structure, proceeding as expected. He sat for a long time with his hands above the keys. Then he typed 3 sentences. Only 3. Species designation, human. Threat classification, inapplicable. Recommend all prior conclave intelligence on this civilization be archived under the heading, What We Were Wrong About. He looked at the 3 sentences. He thought about adding more. He thought about the file. 11,000 pages of 30 years of watching a species through the wrong lens, cataloging the things they showed you, and missing entirely the things they did not. He thought about the 7 anomalies in the outer system that he and Liz had agreed to call interference artifacts and which had turned out to be ships. He thought about Okafor's smile in the receiving bay. He thought about the pen, the ordinary ballpoint, liquid ink, ancient scratching technology, and his own signature beside Okafor's on 2 sheets of pressed plant matter. He thought about on schedule. He thought about, we decided we would only have that conversation once. He did not add more. 3 sentences was enough. 3 sentences was, in fact, more honest than 11,000 pages had been, because 3 sentences admitted the size of what they had not known, and admitting the size of what you did not know was, he thought, perhaps the only useful thing a 400-year-old diplomat could do at the end of a week like this one. He closed the log. Outside his window, Earth turned, the same blue and white and brown it had always been. The same wet rock at the edge of the same ordinary spiral arm. The same thin layer of air and water and 7 billion people going about whatever they did in the evening. Their cities lit against the dark side of the planet. Their quiet and total certainty that tomorrow would follow today going about its business the way it had for as long as there had been a tomorrow and a today. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the file, about the wars and the burning atmosphere, and the stubborn, unreasonable persistence. He had read all of it and understood none of it, because he had read it as a record of failure. And it was not that. It was a record of practice. 10,000 years of being the most dangerous thing in their own world. 10,000 years of building and destroying and building again, of surviving their own worst moments, of getting very good at something no one wanted to be good at. And when something had appeared on their sensors, something larger than anything they had faced before, They had looked at it and made a decision. One conversation, one time, on their terms. And then they had gone to work. In the morning, the Conclave Fleet turned for home. 43 ships, moving together in the formation they always used. The sovereign patience at the center, the rest arranged around it in the geometry of authority and history, and 4 centuries of being the largest thing in any room. Vile Soarath stood at the window of his quarters and watched Earth fall away behind them, getting smaller the way all things got smaller when you left them, until it was a blue point of light among other points of light and then simply part of the sky. He thought about the council, about the report he would file beyond the log entry, about the conversation, the long, difficult, necessary conversation about what the partnership framework meant for the conclave's existing structure, what it meant to have a species at the table that had not joined but had chosen to build something new beside you, what it meant to have shaken hands with something that had been quietly building its answer for 18 years while you were still working through the protocol for asking the question. He did not know how that conversation would go. He had known how every conversation went for 400 years. He did not know how this one would go. He found sitting with that, not knowing in the quiet of his quarters while the fleet moved through the dark toward home, that it did not feel the way he expected it to feel. It did not feel like loss. It felt like the first day of something that did not have a name yet. Outside, the stars held their positions, fixed and cold and patient, the way they had always been, the way they would always be, indifferent to the small and significant things that moved between them, carrying their histories and their certainties and their thermoses of tea, making their decisions, building their answers, arriving on schedule. He watched them for a while, then he went to bed.